For 26 years, my husband introduced me at parties as just my wife. Not my wife, Diane. Not my partner. Just my wife. As though I were a small appliance he'd acquired and forgotten he owned. He believed, after 26 years of my running our home and raising our children, that I had no idea how the money worked, no skills the world would pay for, and nowhere to go. So when he decided to leave me for a younger woman and keep nearly everything, he assumed I would sign whatever he put in front of me. What he never once considered in 26 years of underestimating me was that the woman who managed every detail of his life had been quietly paying attention to every detail of his. My name is Diane Castellano. I'm 52 years old. And this is the story of how my husband spent 2 years secretly planning to discard me, and how the just a housewife he dismissed turned out to have built a far better case than he ever imagined. Let me tell you about the marriage, because you have to understand how I became invisible before you can understand how that invisibility became my greatest advantage. I married Richard when I was 26. He was charming then, ambitious, going places, and I was swept up in it. We agreed, or I thought we agreed, that I would leave my career to build our home and raise our family while he climbed. And climb he did. I should tell you what I gave up because it matters to what came later. At 26, I was not a woman with nothing. I had a degree in finance, of all things, and a promising start at a firm where my managers had already marked me as someone to watch. I was good with numbers, good with people, good at seeing the whole picture, the exact skills I would realize decades later that Richard built his entire career on. When I was pregnant with our first child, we sat at our little kitchen table and made what felt like a reasonable, even loving decision, that one of us would step back to raise our family, and since Richard earned more, it would be me. I remember he held my hand and said, "It's a partnership, Diane. Your work at home is just as important as mine out there. We're a team." I believed him. I want you to know that I believed him completely, because the slow death of that belief over 26 years is the quiet tragedy underneath this whole story. Over 26 years, Richard rose from a mid-level manager to a senior executive, the kind with a corner office and the company car and the salary that came with several commas. And the entire time I made that climb possible. I raised our 2 children almost single-handedly while he traveled. I ran every aspect of our household. I hosted the dinners that charmed his bosses. I remembered the birthdays of his colleagues' wives, sent the cards, managed the calendar, handled the contractors, paid the bills, organized our entire lives down to the smallest detail, because Richard, for all his executive brilliance, could not have told you where we kept the spare house key or what our children's teachers were named. And somewhere in those 26 years I became invisible. It happens slowly to women like me. You give up your career, and the world stops seeing you as a professional. You pour yourself into a family, and the family starts to take the pouring for granted. Richard stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as infrastructure, as the reliable, invisible system that made his life run, like the plumbing or the electricity. You don't thank the plumbing. You don't consult the electricity about its feelings. You just expect it to work, and you only notice it at all when it stops. I want to be honest, I let it happen for a long time. I told myself it was fine, that this was just what a long marriage became, that the lack of respect was a fair trade for security. I was wrong about the security as it turned out. But I was not wrong, it would emerge about my own capabilities. Because here is the thing Richard never understood about the woman who ran his household. Managing a family's entire life for 26 years is not the absence of skill. It is a masterclass in logistics, in finance, in negotiation, in seeing the whole board at once. I had been the chief operating officer of our entire life. He just never gave the role a title, so he never noticed how good at it I had become. The trouble, though I didn't know it was trouble yet, began about 2 years ago. Richard changed. Subtly at first. He started going to the gym, which he hadn't done in a decade. He bought new clothes, younger clothes. He became protective of his phone in a way he never had been, turning it face down on the table, taking calls in the other room. And he became somehow both more irritable with me and more absent. The particular combination of guilt and checked-outness that I would later understand is the signature of a man who has already left in his heart and is just handling the logistics of leaving. In fact, I knew. I want to be clear about that. I am not a foolish woman, whatever Richard believed. I knew, the way you know weather coming, that something had fundamentally shifted. My first instinct, the instinct I think most people have, was the human one. To confront him. To cry, to demand answers, to have it out. I came very close more than once. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't is the reason this story ends the way it does. My closest friend from college is a woman named Patricia. We had drifted, as friends do, into the once-a-year lunch kind of friendship, but we'd stayed in touch. And Patricia, it so happened, had spent the last 25 years becoming one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in our state. Over one of our lunches about a year before any of this, Patricia had said something to me. Not about my marriage, just in general, telling war stories about her work. That lodged in my mind and would not leave. She said, "Diane, you would not believe how many women come to me the day after they confront their husband. And by then it's too late. Because the moment you confront him, you start the clock. And a man planning to leave has usually been planning it for a year already. The smart ones, the ones who win, they figure out what's happening, and then they say nothing. They get quiet. They get a lawyer before he knows they need one. They get their documents in order while he still thinks they're asleep. The confrontation feels good for about 10 minutes and it costs you everything. Silence costs you nothing and it wins." I had filed that away, the way you file away a friend's professional wisdom, never imagining I'd need it. Now, watching my husband turn his phone face down at our own dinner table, I remembered every word. So I did not confront Richard. I did something far more dangerous to his plans. I went quiet and I went to see Patricia. I want to tell you what those next several months were like, because the patience it required was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than childbirth, harder than the years of raising children essentially alone. Every single day, I had to look at the man I had spent 26 years with, knowing what I increasingly knew, and reveal nothing. I had to keep hosting the dinners. I had to keep managing the household. I had to keep playing the part of the oblivious, contented wife, the very role he'd cast me in, while underneath, with Patricia's guidance, I built my case. There was one evening that nearly broke me. Richard came home from a late meeting, and as he hung up his coat I caught the scent of an unfamiliar perfume, and I knew with absolute certainty where he had actually been. He sat down at the dinner I had made and he asked me distractedly, scrolling his phone, "Good day?" And every cell in my body wanted to pick up the plate and tell him exactly what kind of day I'd had. The day I'd spent in Patricia's office, tracing the money he was hiding from me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to make him feel 1/10 of what I was feeling. And I sat there and I smiled and I said, "Quiet day. Yours?" And he said something about the meeting that I knew was a lie, and I nodded as though I believed it. That night I went into the bathroom, ran the water so he wouldn't hear, and cried as quietly as I have ever done anything. And then I washed my face and I came out and I went back to building. Patricia had warned me it would be like this. "The hardest part isn't the work," she'd said. "It's holding your tongue while he thinks you're a fool. Every day you stay quiet, you get stronger and he gets more careless. Let him." And here is where Richard's greatest weakness was revealed. The weakness that would undo him completely. He thought I didn't understand the money. He had always thought that. He'd handled the investments and the real business stuff, and he genuinely believed that I, who paid the household bills, had no comprehension of the larger financial picture. He could not have been more wrong, and his being wrong was entirely his own doing. Because for 26 years, I was the one who organized every piece of paper that entered our house. I filed the tax returns he signed without reading. I knew where every account statement was kept because I was the one who kept them. I had, sitting in our own home office, in files I had maintained for over 2 decades, a more complete picture of our marital finances than Richard himself had ever bothered to assemble. He thought the person who manages the filing is beneath the person who makes the money. He never understood that the person who manages the filing is the person who knows where everything is. With Patricia guiding me on exactly what mattered, I quietly assembled it all. 26 years of tax returns, account statements going back decades, property records, retirement accounts. And as I assembled, working carefully in the hours Richard was away, I began to find the things he had started to hide. Because Richard, it turned out, had been doing more than buying younger clothes. In the year or so since he'd checked out of our marriage, he had begun quietly moving money. Not all at once, he was too careful for that, or thought he was. But to a woman who had watched these accounts for 26 years, the changes were as loud as alarms. I remember the night I found the first one. I was at the desk in our home office, ostensibly paying the household bills, which I did every month and which Richard never thought twice about. But I was also now looking. And I pulled up a statement for one of our joint investment accounts, and I saw a transfer out, a large one, to an account I did not recognize, at a credit union we had never used in 26 years of marriage. To anyone else it might have looked like an ordinary transaction. To me it was a scream in a silent room, because I knew every account we had the way a mother knows her children's faces, and this was a stranger. I sat very still, and then I did not call Richard, and I did not confront him. I wrote down the date, the amount, the account number, and I kept looking. And the more I looked, the more I found. A loan to a business associate named Gary that did not behave like any loan I'd ever filed, with no terms and no repayments. Assets quietly shifted out of the places I could see, and into places he assumed I couldn't. A second transfer in July, smaller, as if he'd grown bolder after the first one went unremarked. He was doing what unfaithful, departing spouses so often do. He was hiding marital assets in preparation for a divorce, trying to shrink the visible estate so that when the day came there would be less for me to claim. By Patricia's estimate, once we traced every thread of it, he had attempted to move and conceal approximately $1.4 million of our marital assets. $1.4 million. Of money that was, under the law, as much mine as his, earned during a marriage I had made possible with 26 years of unpaid, unthanked labor. He was stealing from me in advance, and he was so certain of my ignorance that he barely bothered to cover his tracks. Why would he? You don't hide things carefully from the plumbing. But I saw all of it. And with Patricia's help I documented all of it, every transfer, every concealed account, every suspicious loan, building a forensic record of attempted asset concealment that, in our state, carries serious consequences for the spouse who attempts it. A court that catches a husband hiding marital assets does not merely divide those assets fairly, it tends to look very unkindly indeed on the deception, and that disfavor colors everything else it decides. I had one more advantage, and it was the one that still makes me smile. Because I had managed our household for 26 years, I had also, unknowingly, documented my own contribution, every contractor I'd hired and managed, every event I'd run, every aspect of the domestic and social infrastructure I'd built that had freed Richard to earn. Patricia explained that this mattered enormously. The law in our state recognizes the contribution of a homemaker spouse to the marital partnership. Richard's lawyer would surely try to paint me as a dependent who had simply lived off his success. I had sitting in my files 26 years of evidence that I had been the operating engine of everything he'd built. I wasn't a dependent. I was an unpaid executive, and now I could prove it. The day Richard finally made his move, I was ready in a way he could not have conceived. He chose, I'll give him this, a coward's venue. He did it at a nice restaurant in public, clearly calculating that I would be less likely to make a scene somewhere with white tablecloths. He had a manila envelope with him. And over the entree, with the rehearsed solemnity of a man who has practiced his speech in the mirror, he told me that he had been unhappy for a long time, that we had grown apart, that he thought it was time for us both to move on and find happiness. And then he slid the manila envelope across the table. Inside, he explained, was a proposed divorce settlement that his lawyer had drawn up, and he hoped I would see that it was more than fair and that we could handle this like adults, without lawyers making it ugly and expensive. The settlement was an insult. It offered me a fraction of what I was legally entitled to, structured around the deflated, hidden version of our assets, the picture that existed only if you didn't know about the $1.4 million he'd concealed. It was the offer of a man who believed he was negotiating with someone who couldn't read the board. He even, and I will never forget this, reached across and patted my hand and said, "I know this is overwhelming, Diane. Take your time. I just didn't want you to worry about finding a lawyer and all that stress. I've taken care of everything. I've taken care of everything." 26 years of those 4 words. He'd taken care of everything, and I was to remain the grateful, managed wife right up to the moment he discarded me. I looked at the envelope, and then I looked at my husband, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. I smiled at him, a real smile, almost warm, because the moment I had quietly prepared for across all those patient months had finally, actually arrived. "Thank you, Richard," I said. "That's very thoughtful. But I'm afraid I won't be needing to find a lawyer." I reached into my own bag, and I set my own envelope on the table beside his. It was thicker than his. I had made sure of that, I'll admit. A small vanity, but I had earned it. I already have one. You may remember Patricia from my college days. She's spent the last 25 years becoming rather good at this. We've been working together for several months now. I watched the first crack appear in his certainty. It was a beautiful thing to see. The precise moment a man who has scripted an entire conversation realizes the other person has been reading from a different play the whole time. Inside that envelope, I continued, calmly, unhurried. The way he had been unhurried is our response. I think you'll find it reflects a more complete understanding of our marital assets than your proposal does. For instance, it accounts for the full estate, including the approximately $1.4 million you've spent the last year moving into accounts you assumed I couldn't see, the transfers to the account at the credit union, the loan to your associate Gary that somehow has no repayment terms and no interest, the assets you shifted in March, and then again in July when you thought a second quiet move wouldn't be noticed. I watched the color drain from his face with each specific date, each specific number. I have all of it, Richard. Documented, dated, organized. Because I have been the one filing every financial paper in this house for 26 years, and you signed every tax return I put in front of you without ever once reading it. You handed me the complete picture of our finances one piece at a time for 2.5 decades, and you thanked me for taking the paperwork off your hands. I simply kept it. All of it. Richard had stopped eating. He had, in fact, stopped moving entirely. The fork was still in his hand, suspended over the plate, forgotten. Diane, he started, and his voice had changed, the executive smoothness gone out of it. You don't look, this is more complicated than it looks. The money, there are reasons. There are always reasons, I said gently. But it isn't complicated, actually. It's very simple. In this state, a spouse who is found to have concealed marital assets in anticipation of divorce is treated very harshly by the court. Patricia can explain the case law over many billable hours if you'd like, but the short version is that the judge will not only award me my fair share of everything, including the $1.4 million you tried to make disappear, but will treat your attempt to hide it as evidence of exactly the kind of bad faith that shapes how a judge divides everything else, including the things you currently believe are safely yours. I let that settle, watching it land. You built your entire plan on the belief that I didn't understand the money. I'm afraid that was the single most expensive assumption of your life. He tried, of course. The men like Richard always try. He shifted, in the space of about 90 seconds, from shock to bluster to a sudden, nauseating attempt at warmth, reminding me of our years together, our children, the good times, suggesting that surely we could work this out between us without lawyers and judges getting involved. Suggesting, in other words, now that I held the cards, that we return to handling it privately, which is to say, on terms he could control. No, I said. We're going to handle it exactly the way you said you didn't want to. With lawyers. In the open. Where everything gets seen. You wanted to keep this quiet, Richard, because quiet is where you win. I've learned that the people who underestimate you are counting on your silence. So we're going to be very, very loud about the truth instead. Here is what happened after. The divorce did not go the way Richard planned. It went the way the evidence dictated. When his lawyer understood the scope of what we had documented, the concealment, the forensic trail, the complete picture of an executive who had tried to defraud his wife of assets she'd spent 26 years helping to build, the negotiating posture changed overnight. There was no longer any question of the insulting settlement. The concealed $1.4 million was brought back onto the table where it belonged. The homemaker contribution I had so thoroughly documented was recognized. And Richard's attempt to hide assets, far from protecting him, became the millstone that sank every other position he tried to take. Because a spouse who has been caught lying to the court about money has very little credibility left for anything else. I will not tell you the exact figure of the final settlement, but I will tell you that it was many times what Richard had slid across that restaurant table, and that it reflected, for the first time in 26 years, the actual value of what I had contributed to our life. I kept the house, the home I had built and run and made. I received my full and fair share of the assets, visible and hidden. And I walked out of the marriage not as the discarded, dependent wife Richard had planned to leave with a pittance, but as a 52-year-old woman with the means and the freedom to build whatever came next entirely on her own terms. Richard, I'm told, did not marry the younger woman after all. These arrangements, it turns out, are often less sturdy once the executive salary is being divided in half by a court. I don't know the details, and I find to my mild surprise that I don't care to. He occupies very little space in my mind now. That is its own kind of victory, perhaps the truest kind. And me? I did something with my settlement and my freedom that I think my younger self, the one who gave up her career at 26, would have been proud of. I went back to work, not because I needed the money now, but because I wanted to use the mind I'd spent 26 years being told I didn't have. It started small. A friend asked me to help her sort out the chaos of a family business's finances and scheduling, because she'd watched me run my own life like a precision instrument for years. I did it in a weekend, she told another friend. And within a year, almost by accident, I had built something. I now consult for families and small businesses managing exactly the kind of complex domestic and financial logistics I'd been quietly mastering unpaid for half my life. I help people see the whole board the way I learned to see it. I am, at 52, finally being paid, and paid well, for the executive work I did for free for 26 years. The degree in finance I set aside at 26 turned out not to have expired. It had just been waiting, like everything else I'd quietly kept, for its moment. The first time a client introduced me to someone as Diane, who is brilliant with this kind of thing. I genuinely could not function without her. I had to step away for a moment, because I realized I had waited 26 years to be described that way by someone whose life I was holding together. Richard never once managed those words. A near stranger said them in my second month of work. That told me everything about which of my two lives had been the lie. I want to leave you with the thing Patricia told me at that lunch, the thing that turned out to be worth more than the $1.4 million. The world looks at a person who has spent decades in an unglamorous, invisible role. The homemaker, the assistant, the support, the quiet one who handles the details. And it makes a lazy and catastrophic assumption. It assumes that invisible means powerless. That because no one was looking at you, you weren't seeing anything. But it is precisely the opposite. The person no one is watching is the person free to watch everyone else. The spouse who manages every detail is the spouse who knows where every detail is buried. Richard spent 26 years not seeing me, and he mistook my invisibility for blindness. He never understood that I saw everything, and that the woman who quietly runs the whole operation is the most dangerous person in the house to underestimate. My name is Diane Castellano. For 26 years, my husband called me just my wife. He spent 2 years planning to leave me with nothing, certain I didn't understand the money. He handed me every document I'd ever need, signed each one without reading it, and never once imagined I was paying attention. I was always paying attention. I was just waiting for the right moment to say so. If this story meant something to you, stay a while. There are more like it here, stories about the people the world dismisses as invisible, and the calm, patient, perfectly documented moment they reveal that they saw everything all along. No shouting, no scenes, just the quiet, devastating truth, set gently on the table beside a much smaller lie. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.